Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't it a pleasure and a blessing to be part of this process to ascertain new leadership for our diocese? I am delighted to be on the transition team. My name is Amy Paget. I'm from St. John's, Lafayette. I'll be moderating this evening, which basically means I will be asking your questions. And it is my pleasure to introduce someone who's no stranger to our area. So let me introduce the Reverend Bruce Gray, Canon for the Ordinary Diocese of Indianapolis.
And I need to start by introducing Kathy, my wife. Many of you know her as well. And since we are under such time constraints, I won't sing the many praises I could of Kathy, but instead we'll go right to Amy in the questions.
Okay, our first question, is the mic on? No. Try again? Okay. The first question, the Diocese of Indianapolis is comprised of many small parishes, most of them outside metropolitan Indianapolis. How have you built community across geographic, economic, and social differences? And how will this experience help you build community in the diocese?
Thank you. Well, some of you may already be answering this question in your own mind if you've been part of Vestry College or Pathways to Vitality 1 or Pathways to Vitality 2 or many of the other programs that I've been part of. And I think one of the key things that cuts across all these programs is building relationships. That's what it's all about in terms of having a sense of diocesan unity, is people throughout the diocese feeling like they have a connection through the symbolic nature of the bishop and also the diocesan staff. So you've seen how I've done it with those programs. You've also probably seen me do it by simply showing up. That's a major part, I think, of building community in the symbolism of the bishop, is being present. I frequently go to all of the congregations in the diocese already, but I think we could even do a step further than that. And that is have the diocesan staff as a body go to different places around the diocese, have a work day for the diocesan staff at St. John's, Washington, or St. Paul's, Evansville, or St. Philip's, Indianapolis, wherever it is that a congregation would welcome us as a staff to hold office hours for a full day and be part of the life of that parish. Hopefully the day would be chosen very carefully. So it might be a day where the feeding ministry is taking place or particular teaching programs going on that the staff could support, so that the staff itself and the bishop are part of an everyday type of day within a parish. Too often, diocesan staff and bishops just see the pomp and circumstance of the bishop's visitation. But this way, we would be part of the everyday life. Another dimension, of course, is listening very carefully to what it is people want to have happen. So it's not just the circus coming to town, but instead is in fact something that's going to happen in their parish, in their community, that makes sense for the ministries going on in that place. So that we have, for instance, a parish that might be involved in some kind of local political debate, something, say they want to open a homeless shelter. Well, if you know the bishop can be scheduled to be in your town on a certain day, or in your community or your neighborhood, you know you could utilize the symbolism of the bishop to sit down with the city council members, the city manager, the mayor, whoever it is that's involved in those kinds of decisions. That, in a sense, the diocese would keep coming to you rather than people having to come to a diocesan office. I think that would be key to putting together a sense of us being together. But there's all other things we can do as well. I think something we haven't been very good at is having, in a sense, affinity groups among parishes. Parishes of similar sizes, similar dynamics, regardless of where they are geographically in the diocese, could be pulled together voluntarily only to work together on different projects, share the wisdom they've gathered by being a congregation of a certain size with a certain dynamic, be together in ways that really helps build up the body rather than having people feel so isolated. Because that's ultimately what we're concerned about in this kind of question, is people feeling like they're lone wolves out there, involuntarily, but that they feel like they're all alone. And that, of course, is the exact opposite of what Christ talks about in any kind of sending of people into ministry. They're always at least 2 by 2. And so it's just so important that we break down the barriers between people and be able to say, yes, let's gather together and see how we're all in this together in sharing the love of God in central and southern Indiana.
And our second question is, how would you use your amplified voice in the church to serve our call to promote justice and the dignity of every human being in the church, in the local community, and in the greater world?
One thing I would be is very realistic about how amplified my voice might be. Often today in this era of social media, we live in echo chambers where we post something and we get a whole bunch of likes or reposts and we think, great, I'm communicating. When in fact, it's just people who are already agreeing with us who are sending along the message and just bouncing it back to us. So I think sort of like my answer a moment ago, it's also about building up relationships, where if we really want to have an amplified voice as a diocese, if the bishop really wants to have an amplified voice, he or she needs to know who is being talked with. They have to be able to spend the time to get to know the political officials. They have to be able to be willing to spend time to get to know the local mayor in Washington or Evansville or Indianapolis, so that when there is something that needs to be talked about, there's credibility, that we're not just some goofy Christian who's writing another silly letter to the editor, but instead it is the Bishop of Indianapolis, the Episcopal Diocese serving central and southern Indiana, that politician knows is someone they can work with, someone that has sanity about them. Because one of the things we have to be honest about is that most Christians in our society are seen as nuts. And that when we speak out on an issue, the people turn down their hearing aids, so to speak, even if they're 18 years old, and just tune us out. Whether it's an 18-year-old or the mayor, we have to establish credibility. And I think that happens by establishing relationships, of not waiting until the crisis hits to suddenly pop up and say, hey, I want to be a public figure, but instead building up the relationship along the way so that when the crisis hits, someone actually wants to listen to what the bishop wants to say. And there are a couple of different important techniques to that. One is to be available. In the same way that a bishop needs to be available to the diocese, I have found when I was a rector that if I was available to the local press, then they would turn to me when they needed a comment from someone churchy. And that meant that when my, back in the day, pager went off and I saw it was a newspaper, I returned that call immediately, because most reporters have maybe 45 minutes to create a story and turn it in. They can't wait till the next morning. They can't wait for the clergy to ponder deeply like we could maybe 40 years ago. Instead, it has to be an instant response. And so part of that amplified voice is anticipating what might need to be said about something, to try to stay ahead of the news cycle and be prepared with statements, even if it's just in the back of my mind, but probably written down in a few places, so that when something pops, we can be ready with a statement that can go out within minutes and be part of that initial news cycle rather than waiting for the time that it used to take sort of to have the scroll written and it tossed out into the public square to be read. So I think it's building relationships and it's being ready to respond very quickly that will help make that amplified voice be heard and have credibility in a world that really does not expect the church to say much of any use.
How do you see yourself as pastor to the pastors?
I think this is one of the most important things that a bishop does, I think it's one of the most important things that a Christian does, and that is take care of one another. That if we do not have clergy, and if we do not have lay leaders who feel beloved, who feel supported, who feel courageous, our church will go nowhere. But if we have clergy and lay leaders who know that they have a bishop and a diocesan staff who are backing them up, who are encouraging them to take risks, who want them to have courage, then God's will can really begin to happen in ways we can't even plan for. It can be so miraculous. So I think a big part of this is tying in with the first two things I said. It's about relationships. That the last thing I would want to have happen is if someone sees my caller ID on their cell phone, they go, "Oh no." I was a rector long enough to have that feeling. But instead, hopefully a "huh," or an even "oh good." I don't have enough time to tell you some of the great stories I have around that, but someday hopefully I'll get a chance to. But it's crucial for the bishop to have an existing trusting relationship with the clergy and the lay leaders, to be a pastor to that level of leadership within the diocese, so that they can feel energized, so that they can feel like they can take the risks that are needed to spread the love of God. Because too often, leaders feel like they have to play it safe, to keep their job safe, to keep their role safe if they're a volunteer in a church, rather than be willing to step out in faith to something crazy that God may be calling them to do. So one of the things that I've tried to do as canon of the ordinary is always give people permission to fail. And I remember in my first week, priest saying, "I've never heard that from anyone who worked in a diocesan office before." So when I remember, I've repeated that over the last 7.5 years. And that's something that I would certainly want to have put in permanent marker on my hand if I were a bishop, so I could keep saying it. That it's crucial to feel free to fail without penalty so that we can take the risks that God needs us to take. And I think that's a major part of pastoring the leaders. There's also, though, the very basic of visiting people, especially clergy, when they're in the hospital, or with now the way hospital stays go, when they're at home recuperating, being present with especially clergy when they're in crisis, because most of our clergy work alone. They don't have an assistant priest, or they don't have a rector to support them. And so it's crucial that the bishop be able to do that and feel comfortable doing that, and be willing to drive a couple hours to visit a priest who's in the hospital or who has had a death in his or her family. I think that's part of being a bishop, to help keep our clergy strong. Because we have to, as clergy and lay leaders, be able to embody the love of Christ. And if we don't feel loved ourselves, we won't be able to do that with integrity. And often we can't feel that unless there's a human being right there sharing it with us, embodying the love of Christ in our life, in our living room, in our hospital room. And so the pastor to the pastors, both lay and ordained pastors, I think is an absolute key role for a bishop as we seek to expand the diocese, grow the diocese, and have it have an even deeper sense of being a place where God's love is expressed and lived out in our everyday lives.